Begin by laying out all of your pieces. Here you can see where I'm laying out piece number 9 twice, and then the blue section where I'll cut piece number 1. Next I have to press all of my fabric and recut it because I didn't press it beforehand, which is what you should do. And so now I have to press out all of the wrinkles and trim the pieces back down so that they are accurate to my pattern before I begin sewing. So again, don't be like me, press your fabric before you cut. Now I have this section for pin tucking. I'll begin by folding in at the middle and using that as my guide for all of my pin tuck placement. So I'll mark an inch from that line on the top all the way to the left and the right, and then I'll do the same thing on the bottom. I'll match up from that center line and mark 1 inch away, and now all of my top and bottom markings line up, and when I fold the fabric in half to sew my pin tucks, I will sew from point to point. Here I have my pin tucks sewn in place. I have the right edge of the fabric butted up against the inside right edge of the presser foot so that I have a clean 1/16 of an inch pin tuck all the way down my fabric. Nice and consistent, 1 inch spacing between all of them. And I'm starting at my center line and working towards the left, and then I'll go back and fold in all the pin tucks on the right. This way I make sure that all of my pin tucks are in line and nothing gets off grain as I'm sewing them down. There's about 1 million more of these to go. It takes a long time, but this is the best technique for preparing gray goods to cut out stamper pieces when you have pin tucking or any kind of smocking. This is the best technique to use. So once I finish up all my pin tucks, I will go to the wrong side of the fabric, and pulling the fabric taut, I'm going to give it a good press just to make sure that there's no give in my fabric. And now when I line up my pin tucks, I want them somewhat symmetrical. I'm not too picky, but just so long as they're basically book matching my piece number 1 as I pin it in place on my pin tucked fabric. And I pressed it out really well so that it wouldn't accidentally get distorted when I cut it out. I don't want it to get bigger or smaller than it should be. I want it to be true to the pattern that I'm cutting out. So I'll cut away all of the extra scrap, and now piece number 1 is also ready. Next I'm going to attach some 1 1/4 inch bias together. So going from this corner to that corner at 1/4 inch, that will give me the perfect seam to attach my bias. And I'll begin and end this stitch with a back tack. And after I sew my bias down, you can see that's how I get the top and bottom edges to align nice and pretty. So now that I have my bias, it's time to bust open that seam so that one side of the seam allowance is going one way and the other is going the other direction. And now I have the fabric folded over against itself face inside, and I'm lining up the edges and pressing it over. It was 1 1/4 inch bias, so it's 5/8 once it's finished, and I'll press that whole strip down, and now it's ready to be stitched. Now I have my collar piece. I'm going to stitch down the short side, all down the longest side, and then back up the other short side, leaving the top open. So I'll start with a back tack and stitch almost to my 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to set my needle in and do a single stitch manually at a 45-degree angle, and then line up for my next side. When mitering corners like collars, this is a nice trick to give a crisp, clean point when we turn it out to the right sides. So again, I'll come up to my corner, manually set my needle, and rotate my fabric 45 degrees and put in a single stitch length, and then continue up that short side and end with a back tack. And now I have my bias. I'm stitching it at 1/4 inch, and I have my left hand positioned so that the machine is pulling the bias tape through my hands, and my right hand is just making sure that the bias that's being fed into my left hand is free of twists and tangles. Slow down a little bit for that seam, and then continue stitching at 1/4 inch all the way down the remainder of my spaghetti so that it will be ready to flip right side out. Now I have my collar, time to trim my corners, so I'm going to cut as close to the thread as I can without touching the thread. I want a little bit of fabric in the seam allowance to help hold the stitch in place, but I want to remove a lot of that bulk of that seam allowance once it gets flipped right side out into the corners. So after I get it flipped open, I want to press this seam. This will help set my stitches, but it'll also make it a lot easier to turn this edge and get a crisp edge on the exterior. Now I'm using a pin to pick out that corner and get a nice pretty corner for my collar on both sides. These corners were giving me a little bit of trouble, but you want to get it nice and crisp and clean before the top stitching and before you really set in the pressing. If it's not right before you press, it makes it harder to flip out those corners. So now I'll flip it over and press the other side really well, and now my collar is ready for top stitching. And now I've got my spaghetti and my spaghetti turner, so I'll feed the spaghetti turner into one end of the spaghetti all the way down until the other corner, and then I'll attach the hook into the corner and pull the spaghetti in on itself, turning it right side out. Once you have your spaghetti all turned right side out, it's time to give it a good press. I want to press along my seam edge, pressing the seam allowance flat, and that's going to give a little bit of body or volume to my spaghetti and keep it from having ripples and wrinkles and make it have a nice, even, consistent, pretty width to it. That seam is a little tricky, but you can kind of just wiggle it flat and get through the seam, and there you have your spaghetti.